Okay, so this is the last of our tutorial. And what I'm going to do is to describe two additional theorists whom I think are not at all well known within the systems and cybernetics community, but whose work I find interesting. And then I'm going to say some sort of general things about the nature of knowledge and management and epistemologies for management, or the philosophy of science appropriate to management, which I hope will be of interest to you. It'll be of a more philosophical nature. Okay, a man named Elliot Jacks came from Britain. He lived his last years in the United States. He died just recently. He wrote a series of books about management. He was originally associated with the Tavistock Institute in London. But his main contribution is to associate patterns of reasoning with cognitive complexity, with time frame of analysis, with levels of bureaucratic organization, with compensation levels. So basically what he's saying is that people differ in their capability to engage in discussions of complex systems. Some people deal with simple everyday systems, some people deal with systems of medium complexity, and some people deal with long-term conceptual systems. Now, over time, people rise in their ability to deal with more complex systems, but people level off at different stages. So that's the first claim. Second claim is that there are patterns of reasoning that repeat. He identifies five, he calls it a quintave theory, five, but they're really four patterns. And these are the four patterns. Start from the bottom going up. First you have shaping, which would mean operating with well-defined units. Then you have reflecting, which is considering an alternative set of units. Then you have extrapolating, which is working out the implications of the new set of units. And then parallel processing would be developing a combination of the two sets of units. And then you repeat shaping again, which is operating with that combination of parallel units, etc. Now, start at the bottom again. You can have a dependent here and now childhood world where the time frame of reasoning varies from 2 minutes to, say, a week. And in this case, words refer to things and events. So young children learn the names of things. This is a dog, this is a cat, this is a chair, this is a desk. And their cognitive focus is on attaching a name to an object. Then when they begin to think in terms of 1 week to 5 years, language is a tool for classifying things so that you can think of animals or furniture or wooden object or metal objects. So you begin to think in terms of classifications. Then you have the corporate world, in which language is a tool for complex systems. And we've described a number of these, finance, marketing, accounting, personnel management, etc. Each one of these is a description of a complex system, and then at the higher levels of the corporate world you put together these different independent complex languages to determine the direction of the organization. And then if you want to think in terms of ideology in society, you could reason in terms of 100 years to 5,000 years. You have a language for societal and theoretical systems. I guess that would be discussions of capitalism, communism, free market economy, central planning, etc. But in each case, he would maintain that you go through these 5 levels for each one of these categories here. You have the shaping, reflecting, extrapolating, parallel processing at each one of those levels. Now, given, if you assume that it's given, that people do have different levels of cognitive functioning, you want to have the guy at the top have a suitably high level of cognitive functioning. Because if you're at the top of a corporation, you should be thinking in terms of not just years, but decades, and ideally beyond that to 100 or 200 years. If not, your corporation may go bankrupt. And at lower levels of the organization, you also want people to be thinking at appropriate levels of cognitive complexity, which is associated with time frame of reasoning. That is, over what time frame do you plan your activities, or do you supervise the activities of others? And that's also related to compensation levels, because Elliott Jacks, when he would take an airplane, he would interview the people sitting next to him and ask, what kind of work do you do? You know, what time frame of reasoning do you usually think in terms of? What is your compensation level, and are you happy with your compensation level? And he said that it's his experience that if people are happy with their salary, it's because the level of work that they're doing is appropriate to their salary level. And if they're unhappy, they're thinking long term, but they're not being compensated at an appropriate level. So, in any case. So, in terms of stratified systems theory, this is what Jacks calls his work, you can talk about the level of task complexity. And once again, let's start from the bottom, where you have practical judgment, overcoming obstacles, building some piece of equipment. That would be the shop floor and the office floor. Like if the copier breaks down, then you borrow somebody else's copier, would be overcoming obstacles. Diagnostic accumulation, say the line manager who supervises these people and who may see, well, okay, the copier is breaking down regularly, maybe it's time to replace the copier. If you create alternative paths, then you have a unit manager who may be thinking in terms of office equipment, copiers, computers, telephones, internet, etc. Then you have parallel processing paths, the general manager, who thinks in terms of the work performed by the different units. If you can judge the consequences of different paths, then you're a business unit manager. And if you oversee complex systems, you're the executive vice president. And if you construct complex systems, you're the CEO or the chief operating officer. So each one of these different levels of reasoning is associated with a different level in the organization. So Jacks would say that flattening organizations is dangerous because somebody's not going to be managing the variety that needs to be dealt with. He wrote a book called Requisite Organization, but I don't think he had heard of Ross Ashby's law of requisite variety when he did. He just used the same word. But that's what he meant, was that because of the different cognitive styles that people use, if you have a very large organization, you're going to need quite a few levels of bureaucracy in order to cope with the different types of reasoning required throughout the company. Any questions about Jacks' theory? Yes?
Would one argument be made for flattening the organization is that computers do some of that cognitive thinking or processing now?
Computers do cognitive thinking?
They analyze computers coming in. If you look at neural networks and different things, artificial intelligence. Simple example is autopilot. If you look at accounting,
Oh, I see.
you need less and less CPAs to look at stuff because all the stuff that was done prior is now done by the computer and can be checked.
Okay, well that I think would be a case for fewer employees, but not necessarily a flatter organization. In other words, you may be making your human employees more productive, that is the software that helps accountants, maybe making the human accountants more productive. Just as in language translation, that language translation is a notoriously difficult thing, but there are computer programs, or at least there were a few years ago, computer programs that would increase the productivity of a human translator by about a factor of 4. So it may have gone up from that. So that produces a first draft, and then the human interpreter or translator can improve it. So, yeah, I think software can definitely enhance productivity and in some cases replace human activity. Gregory Bateson once said that cybernetics replaces little boys. And what he meant by that was Uh, Before the days of heating systems and thermostats, you would often delegate a little boy to throw a log on the fire at night. And if you saw this movie, I think it's called Master and Commander. It's about sailing ships. And there were boys on the ship. And some of them would just watch an hourglass. And as the sands ran out, you would turn the hourglass. So in a sense, the hourglass and the boy could be replaced with a clock. Another thing they would do would be to check the depth of the water by throwing a line over the side. And also they would throw a line over the side and time how long it would take for it to get from the bow to the stern. So they were clocking the speed of the ship. So depth, speed, time were all functions that were performed by small boys in the days of sailing ships. And so that's what Bateson meant when you have these simple automatic control processes, whether it's a feedback thermostat on the wall or some other counting or device that's used for regulation and control. That's an activity that used to be at least in part human. So I have no problem with that, but in terms of Jacks, I'm pretty sure would argue that when it comes to conceptualizations within an organization, this is one of the things that was discovered when they put in ERP programs, enterprise resource planning programs, these big programs like SAP and PeopleSoft and Oracle, that they fired a lot of people. And then they discovered they couldn't do things that they had done before because those people not only knew how to operate the system, they also knew how to design the next system. And so maybe you don't need them to operate the current system, but you do need them to design the next system. And there are several examples of that led to interest in knowledge management because they fired these people thinking they were just a cost. But then they realized that they also had knowledge which wasn't appearing on the balance sheet. Okay, yes?
How would you link that to what was said this morning about the theory of Deming, where the entire corporation has to be involved in thinking about the process and improving the process? So they have to have a conceptual idea of not only applying the process, but also improving the process.
Yeah. Obviously, you need some balance between I mean, you have to have the people there to design the new system. But to the extent that you can help them with computers or replace the mundane tasks with computers, that I think would certainly be an advantage. Certainly, machinery is more reliable than human beings. Human beings have a tendency to get distracted and so forth.
The question was more, you have this stratification here
Yeah.
of conceptual thinking at several levels.
Right.
Why associate that also with hierarchical levels? Why cannot the same person contribute at each of these levels? The worker on the floor could also contribute to
Yes. Oh, excellent question. Okay. So yeah, why do you associate the conceptual stratification with the number of workers? That's an excellent point. I think you're right. I'd love to hear what Jax would say to that. I mean, one thing that I can say that I'm sure he would agree with is that there is a limit to the level of cognitive functioning of each person, so that each person can deal at his boundary condition and below. This is related to, which is it not Parkinson's law? It's not Murphy's law. Maybe it's Parkinson's law. That people, the Peter principle, people rise to their level of incompetence. Very, very pessimistic notion. But yeah, so you can deal with the complexity below your level of reasoning, and you can raise your level of reasoning through practice and education and increasing responsibility. That's why you generally do rise in an organization to learn how the parts work, and then you rise. Yes?
This is also a good example, a merge of two companies or acquisition of the company. You go from above, and then the rules are implementing on different level of the structure of the company. and give the responsibilities on appropriate level to understand each other, because they can't do more.
Right.
Question,
Yeah, well, the question about merging two companies and different rules of the game, yeah, that's usually been discussed in terms of corporate culture. But certainly different companies do have radically different cultures, rules of the game, and so forth. And mergers often fail because of that. Mergers are often done based upon financial, technological, market considerations without looking at the cultural differences. But if you try to merge MCI with British Telecom, one is a high-tech innovator with a bunch of young guys who wear sandals, and the other is older guys wearing three-piece suits, sort of like the British Post Office. I mean, they don't merge well together, and I think that merger failed. And that can be very costly, whereas if you just hired an anthropologist, to study the two cultures, they could come back and tell you a lot about whether this is going to be a promising merger or not.
Now the culture is again on layers.
Yes, and how they deal with the layer. That's a wonderful point, actually, to combine Jack's theory with corporate culture. I haven't thought of that, so thank you. That's a good research project for a student. Okay, so the next guy that I've discovered rather recently through a friend is a Dutch manager, businessman, and management theorist. He owned, or still owns, an electronics company. I don't think it's a high-tech electronic company. I think they just manufacture equipment that you put into houses and office buildings and stuff like that, switchgear and so forth. But he has done some semi-high-tech thing. I think he was in charge of the team that got the patent for Siemens for a very flat speaker for your cell phone. I was told that. So he's done some high-tech work too. In any case, he owned this company. He might have inherited it, or he started it up. And the problem he faced was that his workers weren't always telling him things he needed to know that were vital to the success of the business. And so now Deming would deal with that in terms of process improvement and so forth. But what Endenburg decided to do was to consult with employees on major decisions and to adopt a system based on consent, not consensus, but consent. Consensus is that everybody agrees. Consent means you don't disagree. You don't have any information that would go contrary to the decision that's being formulated. So the idea is to increase their sense of responsibility not only for their job, but also for the success of the firm as a whole. So everyone is invited to comment on and contribute to the discussion of a decision. And consent just means that you do not object or have reservations about a decision. So if the decision goes badly, you can't then come back and say, well, you guys should have known something. And the reply would be, well, you should have told us, you consented to this. And he did some other things that were very similar in terms of organizational structure, but I won't go into them now. I'm still just learning about his work, but I think it needs to be more well known than it is. Now, I'd like to conclude with a number of comments related to knowledge of management. And what I'm doing now is I'm sort of stepping back and taking a higher level look at what we've discussed up to now. That is, I've told you about several methods that have been developed within the cybernetics and systems community. And I now want to sort of reflect on the nature of knowledge of management. At my university, George Washington University, for several years I taught the introductory course in philosophy of science for doctoral students. It was the only course in philosophy that these people ever had or will have. But we thought it was necessary for PhD students. And what I discovered was that there were factions within the faculty of the School of Business at GW. And this is my way of depicting those factions. That is, you can ask a question: is there a difference between the natural sciences and the social sciences? Now, the majority would say no. There is no difference. They would accept Popper's doctrine of the unity of method. This is from The Poverty of Historicism, where he says every science can be developed in the same way in terms of conjectures and refutations. You make a conjecture, a hypothesis, you attempt to refute it. If you fail to refute it, you accept it tentatively, etc. That will work for any discipline. The alternative view is to say they are different because physical scientists deal with inanimate objects, and social scientists deal with knowing subjects. Now, in biology, you cope with knowing subjects in terms of giving people a placebo versus the experimental drug to eliminate human interaction effects. But going beyond that, there's also the participation of the observer in the system, which certainly happens in the case of management. Okay, so on the question, is there a difference between the natural sciences and social sciences, the people in finance say no. Other people say yes, there is a difference because human beings are not inanimate objects. If you take that view, there's another question. Should we reject the philosophy of science? That is, if the philosophy of science is a theory of how you create knowledge, and it's been developed primarily by looking at physics and the physical sciences, does it apply to the social sciences? And if it doesn't apply to the social sciences, should we just forget about the philosophy of science? And very surprisingly to me, some of the faculty members said yes, we should reject the philosophy of science, which raises the question in my mind, what should take its place? That is, how are you going to construct knowledge if you don't have the philosophy of science as a guide? So my answer would be that you should expand the philosophy of science to include knowing subjects. And I'll say more about that in a moment. So that was my analysis of the faculty in the School of Business until I decided that there's more to it than that, and that you could ask a prior question, which would be, should knowledge in the field of management be constructed in the form of theories or methods? And what I found was that the doctoral course in the philosophy of science assumed theories. That's just the way you construct knowledge at the doctoral level. But an awful lot of what goes on in management is methods. I've just told you about a number of methods. And my experience over the years has been that students really like methods. You tell them a method and they think they can use it. Many of my students work for organizations. They go off and they use it immediately, and they're very happy. Whereas if I engage them in a theoretical discussion, they begin to study the ceiling tiles and sort of lose interest. So I said, well, maybe there's something to that. Let's not assume that the students are wrong and that the professors are right. Let's assume there may be something there. And so if you take that view, that it's appropriate to structure knowledge of management in terms of methods, then you could ask, should the methods be for the use of individuals or groups? Now, things like group facilitation methods are definitely for groups of people. Causal influence diagrams are initially done by an individual but could be shared with a group. So you end up with a large number of methods, either for individuals or groups, as ways of thinking about systems. Now, if you accept this notion that it is appropriate to think of management as a collection of methods and also theories, what goes along with that notion? Well, most philosophers of science would be in the theory category, and the emphasis is on cause and effect, on if-then analysis. If we do that, then that will happen. You look at analysis, reductionism, and you create theories. But Akoff and Churchman studied with a man named E.A. Singer, Jr., who was a philosopher of science at the University of Pennsylvania. And Singer said, no, it's not that simple. you should have a producer product conception of a system. For example, if a manager is trying to build up a new organization, say like the PC development part of IBM at Boca Raton, you have to bring together a lot of things. You have to have office space, office equipment, telephones, people, financing, etc. So these people, the manager produces and the organization produce some product, and it's a matter of bringing things together. Whereas cause and effect says, let's hold everything else equal and just look at this one variable. So it's a very different kind of thinking, producer, product, and if-then. Here you have necessary conditions. If you want to build some new device, there's a bunch of stuff you need that's necessary. It's not just if-then. And synthesis means you have to put things together. You have to think of the larger whole. And there are methods of doing this. Methods are often checklists. So if you think about what managers are doing, this works very well. Now, the interesting thing was that Singer was a philosopher. Churchman and Akoff were philosophy students. They tried to interest their philosophy colleagues in this with basically no success at all. But they found that businessmen were quite interested. So they both ended up in business schools. Churchman was more an academic. Akoff was more a consultant. But that was the evolution. Well, you can then think in terms of two kinds of science, I think, where science one would be theoretical science, science two would be this more method, where here you focus on observation, here you focus on participation, description versus prescription or forecasting. Here you test knowledge, here you solve problems, you extrapolate and forecast, or you create and design. One of the people who's going to be speaking later in the conference, Ranulph Glanville, teaches design to architecture students. So he's an expert on design and creativity. Here you reproduce experiments. Here you achieve agreement or acceptance, consent on decisions. Here the emphasis is accuracy and precision, and there the emphasis is on usefulness. So I think that you can claim that there are just different ways of knowing. So why do methods tend to lead to integration? Well, unlike academics, managers are more likely to be generalists and specialists. Managers focus on getting things done rather than developing ideas. And ideas used in management need to be shared with subordinates. So you have to persuade people. Now you can compare science and management, and these are in your notes, so I may not go through all of this in detail. But you can say that scientists are highly educated, have special training, knowledge is codified in theories, the purpose is to describe how the world works, and knowledge is preserved in terms of scientific literature and taught in science courses. Theories are steps in an endless search for better explanations. Theories change through testing, experimentation, and they're accepted tentatively as the best available explanation of observations. Managers, on the other hand, are sometimes have education in management, sometimes don't. It's one of the fascinating things about management education is that some of the most successful managers have never studied management. Bill Gates would be one example. They just do it. It's not like brain surgery or rocket science. You don't need a degree in order to practice successfully. So knowledge is embodied in the form of methods very often. You teach methods to those under you. It's developed through experience and consulting practice, and the purpose is to help people work together. So methods are learned and passed on. They aid coordination, and they change through imitation, experimentation, and innovation. And methods are accepted ways of improving group performance. Now, let me tell you about a book called The New Production of Knowledge. How many people are familiar with this book, The New Production of Knowledge? Nobody? Really? Okay. Well, this book is very interesting because it's rather well known in Europe. At least among my friends in Europe, they all know this book quite well. It's virtually unknown in the United States. And that in itself is interesting, because what I have found over time is that there are cultural differences in scientific theories. Cybernetics, although it was largely invented in the United States, second-order cybernetics, largely invented in the United States, it never really caught on in the United States. But it caught on very well in Central Europe, Austria, Germany, and so forth. And that was the first thing that let me know that there's something about these theories, points of view, that is culturally connected. Well, this is another example. This was a book that was produced by a team of people from Britain, Austria, I don't know where all, but a bunch of Europeans. And it introduced the notion of Mode 1 and Mode 2 knowledge. And I described this briefly earlier, where Mode 1 knowledge tends to be within a single discipline. It's problem for formulation, problems are set and solved in an academic context, versus knowledge that's transdisciplinary, involving a diverse set of specialists, and they're solved in application. Here you have a kind of Newtonian model of science specific to a field of inquiry, research practice to conform to the norms of a discipline, and you have quasi-permanent institutionally based teams like research centers and so forth, Bell Labs, universities. Whereas over here you have emergent theoretical framework, not reducible to a single discipline. That Deming's work on process improvement would be an example. Research practice is reflexive and socially accountable, and here you have short-lived problem solving. Then you can have hierarchical, conservative team, normative, rule-based scientific knowledge. Innovation is seen as the production of new knowledge. Here you have non-hierarchical, transient teams, consensual, continually negotiated knowledge, and innovation is also seen as a reconfiguration of existing knowledge for new contexts. Well, this goes on. Here's some more. Research practice should be good science versus dynamic practice is characterized by the problem solving, more problem solving oriented. So it's whereas the scientists describe, managers act within social systems. Now let me explain what I mean by that. This is the idea that I referred to earlier, that you can describe systems as ideas, groups, events, and variables, or in terms of ideas, groups, events, and variables. And I would claim that traditional science, Mode 1 science, focuses on variables and ideas. So the idea is to analyze a problem, ideally quantitatively, come up with some equations, solve the equations, extrapolate the equations, come up with an idea for what should be done. And that's what scientists do. That's what scientists are thought to be supposed to do. But then somebody has to take over the idea and act upon it. Okay, so you have to persuade the politicians to act upon your analysis of the world problematique. And if they are persuaded, then you may get some legislation passed, or you may invent some new product, and then and that'll affect the social system. So you can study the social system and come up with some new ideas. So the traditional idea has been limited that science is what's here, but the social process of implementation is what's there. So if you're a social scientist, particularly a manager, you have to deal with the whole thing. Okay, and that's reflexivity. That is, you're both observing the system and participating in the system and changing the system and then stepping back and observing the system. And that's a reflexive process. If you accept that view that the evolution of a society or a corporation is an interaction between ideas and society, here's an example of the history of economics. Let's say you have the First Crusade led to an interest in trade and ancient learning. As they discovered there were advanced civilizations in Greece and Rome. Then you had Marco Polo's trip to China. Science and technology was stimulated by desire to improve trade, led to the Silk Road and so forth. Traders accumulate wealth, nation states develop to protect trade routes. The idea of progress, that your children may live better than you, that was a new idea in history at one time. People strive to produce more than mere subsistence. Then you get the Industrial Revolution in England, Adam Smith's The Wealth of the Nations to explain what's happening. People acted on the idea. You had capital accumulation, urbanization, a growing gap between the rich and the poor, Marx, Engels, and Engels' Communist Manifesto, revolutions in Europe, demands for more equal distribution of wealth, the social reform movements in industrializing countries, child labor laws, for example, then World War I and the Great Depression, then Keynes' theory justifying government intervention in the economy. Finally, World War II, the World Bank, the IMF, and then Friedman's monetary policy, the oil crisis in 1973, the environmental movement, and then you have economic progress in Asia and the liberalization of the communist regimes. Well, that's one way of describing the history of economic thought, that you have a situation and you invent an idea to deal with it. People act on the idea, society changes, you have a new problem, so you invent a new idea to deal with that problem. So you have this constant dialogue between society and science, or between ideas and social systems. You can do the same thing with management. Now this is somewhat arbitrary in terms of the ideas that I selected, but let's say the military needs many rifles. And Eli Whitney invented the notion of replaceable parts. My students are always astounded to learn that the replaceable parts was not always known, that somebody had to invent the idea. But there was a time when every machine was unique. And they may be very similar, but the parts were made individually and they had to fit into the specific machine. And so Eli Whitney, who had a contract to produce rifles for the military, came up with the idea of replaceable parts so that if a part broke, you wouldn't have to go to a blacksmith and make a new part. You could just take one off the shelf and stick it in, so that the parts would be close enough in their tolerances that they were interchangeable. And that was a new idea in the early 1800s. Well, then you had labor-intensive production of textiles, so the jacquard loom was a kind of computerized punch card device that came close to automating textiles. Then you had high cost of automobiles, so the assembly line, efforts to improve production efficiency, human relations movement, logistics during World War II led to operations research, labor management misunderstandings, management by objectives is sort of a contract between labor and management, desire to improve product quality, process improvement methods, new information technology led to re-engineering, but to avoid the problems due to loss of key people, you become concerned with knowledge management, need for faster adaptation, then you have learning organizations or mode 2 knowledge. So once again, you have this dialogue between society and invention or ideas or science, where you solve a problem, invent a solution, act upon it, new problems arise. And I think that's a useful way of understanding the evolution of social systems and the role of science and methods in management, is to think in terms of this constant process of reinterpretation, redefinition, reinvention. So, given that that's rather different from what scientists study, that is physical scientists, biological sciences, the systems they study don't change as fast, and they don't change as a result of the actions of the scientists. But certainly in the case of social systems, economics and management, theories do affect the phenomenon. So, how do you create such a theory of knowledge? Well, I mentioned this in the earlier tutorial, but I'll just refer to it quickly. Thomas Kuhn wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. How many of you have heard of that? Great. Okay. It was very influential, very popular in the 1970s, and continues today. And Kuhn distinguished normal science from revolutionary science. He said you have a period of normal science, revolutionary science, normal science, revolutionary science. And he focused primarily on the transition between normal science to revolutionary science, which he would say comes about as a result of incommensurable definitions. For example, Newtonian mechanics said that mass, length, and time were fixed. Relativity theory said that they're variable. It's a function of relative velocity. Well, those are incommensurable definitions. So you go into a period of a scientific revolution. How do you get back to a period of normal science? Kuhn doesn't say much about that, but there is a principle in the scientific community. It was originally invented by Niels Bohr when they were inventing the quantum theory. It's the correspondence principle. And it says that that a new theory should reduce to the old theory to which it corresponds for those cases in which the old theory is known to hold. A new dimension is required. In other words, think of this as the old theory. You have to add a dimension, and then you get the new theory. Now, the great advantage of the correspondence principle is that everything that supported the old theory also supports the new theory. But now you can explain a larger set of phenomena. And what second-order cybernetics did was to say, pay attention to the observer. And if you pay attention to the observer, which previously was ruled out, then you're in a better position to deal with social systems. Any questions about that? Okay. So that's what second-order cybernetics was doing. First-order cybernetics dealt with the cybernetics of observed systems versus observing system, the purpose of a model, the purpose of the modeler, controlled systems, autonomous systems, interaction among the variables in a system versus interaction between observer and observed, theories of social system versus theories of the interaction between ideas and society. This was a major change in cybernetics. Started about 1974. Well, just recently, Carl Mueller called my attention to an article by Heinz von Forster in which he postulated a triangle that consisted of world, description, and observer. And I think that this triangle is really quite interesting as a way of pulling together a variety of points of view. If you think in terms of Karl Popper's three worlds, you have world one, world two is the observer, and world three is description. World three has always been the most controversial of the three. I mean, people are willing to accept that there's a world and there's an observer, but what about the theories? Are they a different world? Popper said yes, and many people said no, that they're just means to communication among observers. Well, however you come out on that debate, I would maintain that this step one, this is the classical philosophy of science. That is where you're trying to create descriptions of the world. You're trying to create theories that are accurate representations of the world. Second-order cybernetics, which was an effort to understand the functioning of the nervous system, and hence to include the observer within the domain of science, focused on this interaction here between the observer and the description, how the observer creates descriptions of the world. And the work that I have done, and a few other people have done, on methods, I mean, many people work on methods, but not so many people try to explain it in terms of the philosophy of science, is that methods connect the observer to the world. So this is where reflexivity occurs, because you both act as a participant in the world and then reflect on the changes in the world and then act in the world and so forth. So if you then combine the classical philosophy of science with an interest in cognition and observation, the observer, second-order cybernetics, constructivism, and management methods, then I think you have a larger understanding of the philosophy of science. That is, you've expanded the concern with theories and descriptions to include the observer, and that gets you, in a sense, a legitimization of management methods as a way of understanding the world and of understanding organizations. Because the reason I go into all this is because my interpretation of a lot of the literature the scientific literature in the field of management is that people think that the way you do science is like this. But what managers do is more like this. So you get a disjunction between the two, and that if we were to expand our conception of science to include the observer, then I think we would produce knowledge that's more compatible with the way managers think. That you don't have this funny academic disconnect between what academics think they're doing and what managers think they ought to be doing. So I suggest that as a way of proceeding. If you want to know what these 3 bits are, that is, if you want to know what goes here, here, and here, it's related to this table, where this is engineering cybernetics, this is a realist view, how the world works, natural processes. Number 2, biological cybernetics is a biological view of epistemology, how the brain functions, include the observer within the domain of science. Ideas about knowledge should be rooted in neurophysiology. And that 3rd leg, the management methods, it's a pragmatic view of epistemology. Knowledge is constructed to achieve human purposes, etc. How people create, maintain, and change social systems through language and ideas. And ideas are accepted if they serve the observer's purposes. And by changing ideas, you can change society through persuasion, not coercion. So, in conclusion, I think the key to managing complexity is to realize that the observer defines the system. That is, complexity is not inherent in the external world. That different observers will define different systems. That the system is in the mind of the observer. That system is a description. That's consistent with Kolmogorov's notion that complexity is measured by the length of the description, not by measurements of an external reality. Now, we have considered several interpretations of an organization. For example, Deming said, an organization is a set of processes. Each can be improved using similar methods. We looked at Beer, and the structures and functions of an organization can be understood using the viable system model, a model based on neurophysiology. Akoff said, an organization is a social system. That is, the elements are thinking participants. You must get them to work together and to have a shared understanding. And that interactive planning can help people to do this. And then you had Forrester's system dynamics, which is more in the traditional approach to building mathematical models of systems, but nevertheless can be quite effective as a communication device to help people understand larger systems that are harder to depict otherwise. So, different descriptions of organizations lead to different ways of making improvements. Just as there is no one best description of an organization, so there is no one best set of consulting recommendations. And that any suggestions or decisions that move an organization forward often can be helpful. It's not as though there has to be a right answer. Any questions? Yes?
I agree completely on your conclusion that the observer defines the system, and that it is very important to focus on the observer. And I see the reason why in classical sciences you did not do that. You did not analyze the observer, but you take the observer as a given.
Right.
So you define the observer as a very simple system.
Right.
And everybody has to confirm
Right.
this. So in physics, your observer is defined with your tool, and your tool must be reproducible, and it must be simple interaction and everything.
Yes.
So nowadays, with the computers and all the information technology that we possess, we are able to allow observer much more freedom. So not only to interact in one simple way, but you can vary this observer and see what would happen if the observer is like this, or what would happen if it is completely different. If the channels of communications are completely different. So you can afford to change this observer's point of view and interaction.
Yes, I quite agree with your notion of the role of the observer. I think you could eliminate the observer when you're dealing with physical systems. And that worked very well. I mean, it produced very useful knowledge. We have jet planes, the internet, and so forth. I mean, but when it comes to social systems, then I think you really need, I mean, it does make a difference who says something. Particularly in politics, if the Republican says something or the Democrat says something, you interpret the message differently. And that's just inherent social systems. And trying to pretend that you can do social science research and neglect that is a pretty Procrustean notion. Are you familiar with this notion of Procrustes? This is some guy in medieval history who had beds of a certain length, and if his guests didn't fit the bed, he would either put them on the rack and stretch them, or he would cut off their legs or something. So to claim that you can eliminate the observer is, I think, a Procrustean approach to social science. It's not very successful. Yes?
Yeah, given all the discussion on the difference between the theorist and practitioner.
Yes.
I'm just curious, what will be your comment on Kurt Lewin's assertion? He once said that there's nothing so practical as a good theory. Has Kurt Lewin been too optimistic?
Actually, I think it was Immanuel Kant that said that originally. I don't doubt that Kurt Lewin did, but I remember reading once an essay by Immanuel Kant that said the same thing. But I would interpret that to say, to interpret theory rather broadly, that to be a conceptualization. That is, that nothing is so useful as some abstract conceptualization of the system that you're dealing with. Whether that's a theory or a method, it's a sort of another interpretation of the word theory. So I like the quote. I have no problem with the quote, but I would interpret the quote as being beyond, to be conceptualizations as opposed to more narrowly interpreted theory.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yes?
I have a problem with this idea that complexity is in the eye of the beholder. That
Yes.
Look at systems like, say, the weather system.
Yes.
That are inherently unpredictable. How would you apply that idea to such systems?
Okay. If you look at the DVDs from last year, I go through a number of neurophysiological experiments. Let me tell you a story. The question had to do with the observer and so forth. I was told this story that there's a man in Vienna, Rupert Riedel, he died recently, and whenever someone would tell him about second-order cybernetics, he would tell this story. Said there are three people walking in the woods. One was in love, and so looked at the beauty of the woods and was sort of infatuated by the beauty of the woods. The other was a logger, and so he would look at the trees and estimate their height and circumference and how many board feet he could get out of the forest. The other was a scientist who was looking for beetles and beetle infestations. So these three people walk through the woods, and each has a completely different interpretation of the experience, whether it's a beautiful forest, a financial resource, or an ecosystem. However, Riedel would say, none of them bumped into a tree, and none of them impaled some branch on themselves. So there is a commonality. Okay. So the point of the story, I think, is that there is an objectivity and a subjectivity. And the objectivity is you don't bump into trees. The subjectivity, there's a range of interpretation. Now, radical constructivism says that you do construct an interpretation of the world based upon your neurophysiological interaction with the world. So that when you talk about the world, you are talking really about an internal representation that is the result of your experiences with the world. So that we Ross Ashby dealt with this issue very easily, but in a kind of awkward language. See, very often what we do is we say the system exists in the outside world and we create a mental model of it. That's the sort of standard language in the United States. What Ross Ashby says is the machine is the thing out there. Whether it's an organism or a human being, he called it the machine. But the system is a set of variables selected by an observer. Now then you can have a model of that system. But the system is those aspects of the world that you have chosen to pay attention to, which can be determined by your nervous system. Consider the fact that human beings, insects, and dogs live in different perceptual worlds. In other words, dogs can smell and hear things that we can't. And they see differently. Some animals have eyes on the side of their head. But our eyes give us depth perception. And insects, I think, perceive infrared light or something like that. And so they live in different worlds. Now, you can make the claim that it's all the same world objectively. But the world as they experience it is very different. Insects, human beings, and dogs. And that's what the radical constructivists are referring to. They're referring to that internally constructed conceptualization of the, quote, real world. And they're saying that that is determined by the nervous system, and furthermore, that it's determined by the choices that we make as a result of our cultural upbringing. Heinz von Forster has a nice summary. He says, the logic of the world is the logic of descriptions of the world. Right? That's that Kolmogorov quote again. The logic of the world is the logic of descriptions of the world. Perception is the computation of descriptions of the world. And cognition is the computation of computation of computation of computation. Whereas by computation, they refer to the comparisons that go on in the nervous system. Inside the nervous system, you just have bips going on. One neuron is firing and it fires other neurons. So if you stick in an electrode and listen to it, it goes bip, 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 bip. And the result of all that is a three-dimensional world. How do we do that? Well, that's what second-order cybernetics is about, and that's what I described in last year's DVD. So have a look at that. I go through a series of neurophysiological experiences. But the claim of radical constructivism is that the world as we perceive it is constructed in our nervous system and is the product of the nervous system and is constrained by the nervous system. So that we don't perceive infrared, but we can design night vision goggles that perceive infrared. And we can only see so far, but we can build telescopes that allow us to see farther. Yes?
I have a slight problem with your black and white viewing of the triangle. You mentioned
viewing of
the
triangle.
Of the triangle.
Uh-huh.
Because my understanding is that the system exists without observer and in fact without description. It exists as independent body. And that approaches, as you mentioned, observation and description. But me as a physicist, historical physicist, I must say that I can't describe system without observation. So again, on the other side, the manager can hardly take in account only observer without any type of description. So the problem is maybe in weighting, in a weight I give to description and or the value I give to observation. So I wouldn't see as black and white as you perhaps for simplification of the explanation you used to, because it's always a triangle and always must be understood as the system of three independent values or three independent parts of the understanding or learning of the system.
Right. Okay. The question, I guess it's raining. The question has to deal with observation and a black and white distinction between the existence of the world and the existence of the description of the world. And I agree. I mean, I have no problem with the notion that the external world exists. It has its own rules. I have no problem with that at all. What the radical constructivists say is that whatever knowledge you have of the external world has been constructed within your nervous system. Now, this is a point of view that has a social history. And I think it's helpful to understand what the social history is. In a sense, it's an idea that's been invented to cope with a social phenomenon. And it's an idea that was invented largely by people who had experienced totalitarian governments. Heinz von Forster and Ernst von Glasersfeld were both partly Jewish and survived World War II. Umberto Maturana experienced the Pinochet regime in Chile. And their concern was always with how people interpret the world, how people construct descriptions of the world, and how people act upon those descriptions. And their concern was always to try to make people to be more tolerant. And this is why I think the idea appealed to people in Central Europe, or part of the reason why it appealed to people in Central Europe and didn't appeal so strongly in the U.S., because people in the U.S. think they're pretty tolerant, or at least they know they should be tolerant. Whereas in Central Europe, I think the idea is that you are responsible for constructing a philosophical description of the world and of deducing actions from that philosophical description. And if somebody disagrees with you, well, then either they're wrong or they should be eliminated, because that's your whole perception of the world. If somebody disagrees, they've, in a sense, destroyed your world. Americans don't have that idea so strongly. They just say, okay, people different opinions, big deal. There's also the notion that at least in Central Europe at one time, if you had an idea, you should act upon it and you should implement it by any means necessary. And those combinations of ideas led to ideologies, fascism, communism, the war in Yugoslavia most recently. And so they would observe those phenomena and they would say, what is going on here? Why are people acting like this? What are they thinking? And they would trace it to the origin of knowledge. And so they wanted to come up with an alternative conception of knowledge. And so what second order cybernetics is it's a scientific proof of the appropriateness of tolerance because of the necessity of doubt. In Europe, at one time, I'm not sure today, there was an absence of doubt because there was a feeling of certainty based on these philosophical systems. Americans are awash in doubt. They doubt everything. You know, if you propose something, say, well, it works? I don't know. Try it. If it works, fine. If it doesn't, try something else. Whereas in Europe, there's a stronger inclination to say, well, based on the theory, this ought to work. And so you should do this. And I know best, so do what I tell you to do. And it's those different ways of conceiving knowledge, of creating knowledge, and acting upon knowledge that von Forster and others wanted to change. And so they took the classical philosophy of science, used it to study the nervous system, came up with conclusions, namely that all observations are created by observers and observers are the product of their experiences, to cast doubt on the assumption that one person could know for sure, and to legitimize the experience of other people. Say, if those people have a different idea, it's because they have different experiences. They've made inferences based on different experiences. We need to know what they think they know. And so let's do experiments to test that knowledge. So that's the historical social context of second-order cybernetics. And it's not addressed so much to the physical world. It's addressed to our perceptions of the physical world or the social world.
If you speak about Central Europe, what do you mean about? What do you speak about? You know, because I'm coming from Central Europe, you know, so you speak more, if I understand correctly, about German mentality and Anglo-Saxon mentality. If you say it in this way, I would fully agree. Maybe Swedish is somewhere between, or but German, the classical German, we compare with the Japanese, maybe philosophy, which we find a lot of similarities.
Mm-hmm.
And but of course, the Germans style is something. German thinking is exactly what you described. But
yes.
You are, us as a Czechs, a mixture of Celtics, then Slavic, then who are Germans, etc.,
yeah.
etc. Then you are in a mixture, and your mind is open or
right.
closed to a lot of ideas. But generally, you're right.
Yeah.
Understanding from this point of view, as I mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for the comments about Central Europe, because I view it as an outsider, so it's comforting to know that it's roughly correct. That's absolutely my interpretation based on readings. But I can cite some other interpretations. It's very consistent with Kant's idealism. And there's a nice book by Thomas Dewey, an American philosopher, called German Philosophy and Politics. It was published in 1915 to explain World War I, which it explains somewhat, but it's a wonderful explanation of World War II. And basically he traces it to saying that German politics is an outgrowth from German philosophy, and that there are these characteristics of German philosophy that have led to the policies of the German government. And it's a very interesting book, I think.
You can see that Marx, you mentioned Marx and Engels,
yes.
That's again coming from Germany.
Yes. Yeah.
So they are the roots of communism.
Yeah, well, and following up on this notion of Marx and so forth, you could take Das Kapital as a seed that was implanted to different societies. And in Russia, it took the form of an authoritarian one-party state. In Western Europe, it took the form of democratic socialist parties. In the United States, it provided some justification for labor unions. So the idea was interpreted differently in different societies, and it had different results in different societies, which is, I think, further evidence for this proposition that scientific theories or descriptions have a cultural context that needs to be taken.
It was not only philosophy, it was ideology in some
right.
countries.
Well, it was interpreted as an ideology. Right. It's a theory. Good. Yes?
So, currently we have been, the society as a whole, involving larger effort, activities, which say mixed with science, technology, toward the society. So they're going to be even more mixed, components, which we used to be quite comfortable with. If I'm a scientist, a physicist, and I can follow pretty much what we have been adopted or educated about. If I'm a socialist, I can be fairly open and liberal or democratic. But now we are going to do something which is going to have a very significant scientific component to be implemented into a society which is going to change it or in a way we want. So how those kind of the thinking from cybernetics be affecting the large scale social activities.
Well, that's yeah. The question is about how does this work on the nature of knowledge and so forth affect cybernetics and our interaction with societies, and that's why I've been developing these ideas. Is because I find methods very useful as a way of helping people work together, come to common decisions, and implement them. And I find that as a useful way of knowing. But in terms of the classical philosophy of science, that knowledge would not be considered as interesting, as deep, as important as theoretical knowledge. So I've been looking for a way of explaining to myself and my colleagues that developing methods of how people act in social systems, reflect on their actions, act in social systems. I've been searching for a way of explaining that that is legitimate knowledge, that that is useful knowledge, which I think it is, and hence it should be developed further by the academic community. You see, until you accept this kind of knowledge as the way knowledge should be structured, then you cannot bring to bear the resources of the academic community to test and further develop that type of knowledge. That's my claim. So that's what I want to do, is to make it possible for the international academic community to develop these kinds of group decision-making methods, which I find useful, and further improve them so that we can make the changes in social systems that are needed to adapt to the phase transition of the relationship between the population and the environment. Okay, maybe one last. Yeah. Go ahead.
I think the people in the world is on the same internet now.
Mm-hmm.
And in the future, the children now watch the same TV program, almost watch the same TV programs, use content in the internet. So I think the boundary of the thinking of the conscience maybe will more close and more more close to the same thinking model. Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think
yes and no. I'd say, in general, yes, I would like people to be able to communicate and so forth. But there's always the problem of homogenization, that if everybody thinks the same way, that's going too far. And so one of the ideas that I mentioned was the fact that Americans reason down to specifics and Europeans reason up to larger categories. I think ideally you would understand both points of view and use both points of view when they're appropriate. And the question was asked about Asia. Well, I suspect that there are points of view in Asia that are outside that distinction. And one of my concerns is that Asia may try to imitate the West too much and not pay sufficient attention to their sort of inherent cultural ways of thinking about things. And so that's why in my work, very often what I do is I make tables of points of view, like there's this point of view and that point of view and this point of view. So what I would encourage people from other countries to do is to say, take the American and the European perspective and then describe your perspective. What is your perspective different? What problems are you working on? What solutions do you perceive. And let's add on columns to these tables. Let's not just adopt the thinking that currently exists. That'll be a lot more interesting, I think, than just everybody thinking the same way. So add to those columns of knowledge.
May I add to
Yeah.
the internet thing? I mean, internet is more diversifying the society than homogenizing the society. I mean, this just opens all new dimensions, for the creative thinking. So, so the same thing actually goes back to the population issue. I mean, population, if you increase, you consume certain things proportion to the number, but by adding them together with creating ideas, which you add by exponential. So there may be not so close analogous to.
Yes, no, I think this comment about the internet is very important. You can think of it this way. The number of people that you work with is probably small. The ones you work with intensively, probably half a dozen. And then you have several dozen you work with in a more peripheral fashion. With the internet, those people can be distributed any place in space. And so that means you can have little work teams scattered around the world, and everybody can be involved in one or more work teams. And the problem with living in a small town is that there may not be anybody in your town who shares your interests. But if you have access to the world, finding somebody that thinks in a way that's compatible with your way of thinking is much easier. So it could lead to an enormous outpouring of creativity because people are able to find other people that they can work with on some specific problem. You can see this, I think, already in terms of magazines. If you look at the magazines in an airport magazine store, they cover a remarkable range of things, from news, fashion, sports, boating, hunting, etc. And not everybody shares those interests, but enough people share them to support the magazine. And with the internet, you just sort of take that to a new level.
I think what you just comment, I think, can refer to a theory called long tail.
Uh-huh. Okay.
A long tail theory. It means the market demand distribute like this, with a very long tail.
Uh-huh.
And according to the normal marketing model, the corporate only working for 20% to earn the 8% of revenue. But on the internet, because all the demand are very few, the supply are also very few. Once they can match it to each other, the long tail can survive. But not this kind of demand cannot be satisfied by a corporate supplier.
I see.
I think this also can refer to the so-called Web 2 kind of
Web 2.
Web 2
Yeah.
kind of concept.
Internet 2 or whatever. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for that comment on the long tail. Yes.
I came. I came America just 7 months.
Yeah.
Today I listened management the lecture involved every aspect of the society and the science.
Yes.
I want to know. I found church and Bible is very popular in America.
Yes.
I want to know what roles the Bible or church play in American society and science development. Is that one strategy of managing American society?
Okay, well, let me say several things. The question is about the church and religion and science and American society. maybe you've noticed the Bibles in hotel rooms. Those are provided by some organization. I'm not sure what organization, but they've decided that putting Bibles in hotel rooms is something that they want to do, so they pay for the Bibles. Now, there are lots of churches in the United States and lots of denominations, and the Constitution guarantees freedom of religion. And the churches are supported by the people who go to the churches. This is very different from Europe, where the churches are supported by your tax dollars. So you pay your income tax and a certain percentage goes to the church. I didn't know that until I married an Austrian woman and she explained it to me. But that's very different from the United States. So there is a very strong separation between church and state in the United States. Now, having said that, in the United States, the dominant religion is a Christian religion. And the Christian religion grew up within the Roman Empire. So it had to exist within the Roman Empire. And so it defined its task as being separate from the governance of the state. So there's a passage in the Bible, I think it says, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto the Lord what is the Lord's." And so what that's interpreted to mean is that religion is separate from politics, that politics governs the state, and religion is more a private or personal matter. Now, the history of Europe was a history of religious conflict. The 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648 was a war between the Protestants and the Catholics. And the Treaty of Westphalen ended the war and created the concept of a nation state and the concept of religious freedom. So the United States benefited from that history in Europe. And I think that in general, the history of human societies has been that if you can separate church and state, that seems to work better. If you combine church and state, then you're likely to get conflict. Islam, as a religion, grew up in an area where there was no established political structure, so that Islam tends to combine religion and the state. And that's why in Islamic societies, many times they want to use Sharia law as the basis of the political law. And so there are these big debates over whether the laws in an Islamic society should be secular laws or Sharia laws, that is, religious laws. We don't have that debate in the United States because as a Christian society, our historical origin was different. So it's easier for us to separate church and state, whereas in Islamic countries, they are historically intertwined. I hope that answers in part.
Role in science.
Pardon me? What is role in science?
Science and the society policy making.
Well, okay. There's currently a big debate in the United States over evolutionary theory and creationism, which many people would say, and I would agree, is a kind of religion. And so far, the courts have protected science. That is, when you have a conflict between teaching evolution and requiring the teaching of creationism as an alternative to evolution, the courts have repeatedly come down on the side that creationism is not science. But once again, this is a result of the U.S. Desire to separate church and state. Now, it's my understanding that in Britain, in school, you teach both science and religion. But I think you teach religion as an academic subject, so that you could teach Judaism and Christianity and Islam and so forth in religious classes. It's a sort of sociology of religion as opposed to religious doctrine. So in the schools you get some orientation toward religions in general, but not pressing you to join a particular religion. And since religion is in the school curriculum, then you don't get this evolution versus creationism debate in the UK, which we get in the United States because we've even excluded prayer in public schools. So different societies have different way of coping with the issue, but the United States approach has been to try to maintain a strong separation between church and state. In UK, it's not so strong, and so they don't get some of the conflicts that we get.
Yeah, I just recently read an article about this issue and comparing states and Europe. And the core is exactly as it was said. I want only to support what was said, that in Europe, Christianity lost because of connection of power, political power, and Christianity. That means Pope was a strong political person for hundreds and hundreds of years, and this was the core of a losing of position of Christian faith in Europe. They said in this article that in the state, still 90% of inhabitants believe in God. They don't attend church, they don't frequently have any connection to the church, but they have a faith in God. This is nothing true about Europe. Sweden, Czech Republic, they speak about 5%. Compare 90% and 5%. And Sweden was a very Christian country many years ago. Czech Republic was a very Christian country many years ago, but it's gone because of this. And that's why it was important to mention Islam, which has the same problem because it's younger, like Christianity had in the medieval time. So this is some very, US has a very unique situation and very unique position for Christianity, and uncomparable to Europe, because the load of the history of Europe is so strong, so they diminish what they were able to diminish, they did.
As I understand your comments on Europe and so forth, what you're saying is that the church had power and it used the power, and as a result it tended to alienate the people. Whereas in the United States, the church never had political power, although some people have aspired to political power, the Christian right. And that has not alienated people from religion so much. And I would agree with that.
That was not my idea, it was the idea of the author of the paper.
Yes.
I read, but I fully agree with him as well.
Yeah, that sounds right to me.
Yeah, I think, well, I'm not speaking for Europe, but I think there is a field in Europe that is in fact different from what you say. That
Okay.
in the United States, in fact, there is much more a link between religion and government than there is in Europe. That you have, I think, on your banknotes, it's in God we trust.
Oh, yes.
There are, in many cases, the word God is used by the President of the United States. And that is something you will never have in Europe, or at least in most countries of Europe you won't have that. So in that sense, I think in Europe there is much more separation than there is in the US. Maybe not formally, but in practice, the two are linked.
Good point. Yes, this is a continuation of the church and state connection. Yes. Well, I think Americans want their leaders to display some awareness of or interest in spirituality, religion, and so forth. But what they don't want is the authority of the federal government to impose a particular religion. And that's what they're opposed. They want to cut that off through the Constitution and so forth. But you're quite right. There is this notion that we were a nation founded under God, etc. There's a faith in God, and all of our leaders, George Washington, have had faith in God and have prayed and so forth. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that in the sense that prayer is a kind of meditative state where you try to say, okay, what should I do? Tell me God or society or something. What's the right course of action? And if you try to think of, some Father in heaven telling you what to do, that I think seems to be helpful to some people. Some people don't find it helpful, but if they do, fine.
When you look at the almanac, you find that in the demographic description of the countries, you have official religions.
Yes.
What you're saying is that in the States there is no official religion, and that's in the basis of what we are talking here.
Yeah.
Here, there is no such a thing as an official religion. The custom in different countries for different reasons is that there is an official religion.
Yes.
Is the religion of the government or the religion which is the base of government?
Yeah. Well, I think the connection.
I don't think that is the case in Europe. Well, in Europe you have official religions, but there are many. Like in Belgium, it's Catholicism and Judaism and Islam, and almost all countries that are represented that have people.
But there is no the official religion.
No, there is not the official religion. There are many official religions there.
Well, I think.
Why it should be official?
I think we're diverging a little bit from management cybernetics. So let me try to suggest there is a connection here in the sense that religion is one set of ideas that has been invented over time to regulate society. And I once gave a presentation that compared the Catholic Church with the Communist Party. So you could say that you have the Bible and the Das Kapital, and the prophet would be Karl Marx, or it's Jesus Christ or the Bible, and then the head of the church would be the General Secretary of the Communist Party or the Pope, and then you would have the College of Cardinals and the Communist Party and the Politburo and so forth. So that there's a very interesting parallel between the Catholic Church and the Communist Party. And that's fine if you understand that as a conceptual system that's used to regulate society. And you have a priesthood who interprets the doctrine and allows the doctrine to change or not change and adapt to the regulation of the social system. So I think that religion is a reasonable topic to think of in the context of the interaction between ideas and society. And so with that, I would suggest we continue the conversation informally. Thank you all for coming. Yes.